On a mission given to me by Woody Shaw, Sunship, Dizzy, and John Kahn, dedicated to pursuing a piece of our cultural heritage through interviews with my music heroes, this is The Jake Feinberg Show. Welcome everybody inside the Blackwood Broadcasting Studios at an undisclosed Institute of Higher Learning. This is The Jake Feinberg Show, and we're happy to have all of you along with us today. Did you ever feel lonesome? That high, lonesome feeling of Appalachia, where lush green hills and streams created the perfect environment for bluegrass music. How then do you account for musicians who didn't grow up in this region, but were still able to be authentic and true to American roots music? Obviously, it starts in the home, and my guest's home was full of instruments and musicians. He understood the Alamo, and how to beg, steal, or borrow 2 nickels or a dime to croon, yodel, and sing, be it Tex Mex, Bay State Boogie, or the Train of the Sea. Truly, though, my guest was always a performer. However, he was one of these second-generation players who had the opportunity to learn at the foot of the master, Bill Monroe. And what did Bill instill in my guest? How about the idea of cultivating your own sound? What do you have to say for yourself, young man? 'Cause you sure sound a lot like me, and that ain't good. Be yourself and burn. Don't matter if it's in front of 5 people with a total of 3 teeth in a barn in eastern Kentucky. Don't worry about perfection. You need mathematics, but you also need love, spirituality, and urgency when you play this music. Otherwise, it is sterile and nothing like the Blue Ridge Mountains. My guest today is one of the most accomplished American musicians in his generation. Quality and sophistication, adaptability and appreciation of cultures. Inherently a kid from Boston who is as authentic in his delivery as Tex Logan or Red Allen, Winnie Winston or Ralph Rinsler. He has collaborated for the better part of 4 decades with his peers David Dog Grisman, Bill Keith, Jerome Garcia, John Kahn, Richard Green, Warren Smith, Ozzy Allers, brothers Chris and Lauren, John Nagy, Billy Mundy, Herb Bushler, and Bill Stevenson. He shows no signs of slowing down, even if he occasionally feels sorrow for the deeds he has done. Still old and in the way, Peter Rowan, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Jake, that was worth waiting for, man. That's beautiful.
It's poetry, man, and it just flows out of me now. It's, now that I really am being truthful and authentic to myself, this stuff just flows, and it's great to finally connect with you, my friend.
Thank you, and I agree with you, yeah. You find that truth to yourself, and it flows.
I wanted to ask you, so much, whether it was Dizzy Gillespie or Charlie Parker or, John Lee Hooker or Muddy Waters. In your case, it was Bill Monroe. Talk not just about him as a mentor, that's obvious, but the idea of him coming to you and saying, you know what, man, individualism is the key, not comping, but individualism. I mean, how important was that for you, and what kind of challenges, and how did you grow as a musician when he came to you and told you that?
Well, that nobody has ever asked that before, and that's really one of the most interesting sides of the musical life that I've led. Bill was, that quote that you said was after my first performance on the Grand Ole Opry. He said he got a lot of calls and a lot of letters that week, and he said people really like the way I sing, and that's good. And he said, and we sound good together, that's good. He said, and then he said, and they say you sound a lot like me. And he said, that's not good.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Well, what are you going to do when... So what Bill saw me doing was, going to the well of Bluegrass, which was Bill Monroe, and well, I had to adapt my voice to his voice to sing the duets, but he didn't want that so much. He wanted individualism. He wanted you to resist a little bit and fight him, so that he had something to work with. Because the beauty of that blend, that kind of bluegrass harmony singing, is that if it's too perfect, it just doesn't. Well, it doesn't sound quite as doesn't have quite the friction.
That's
Bill wanted friction. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, I've talked to Richard, and he said the same thing. There's a burning quality which doesn't speak. It's not about perfection. It's about authenticity. So continue. I didn't mean to interrupt that.
No, yeah, but I mean, I think the quickest way to feel the heat of the fire is to light the fire. And so Bill was an expert at lighting the fire. And I remember one time we were playing out in the Ash Grove in the West Coast during the first few months that I was touring with him, because I had sort of been in the band more or less, come and gone, and played shows with him. But when I was finally living in Nashville and we went to the West Coast, we were on stage at the Ash Grove, and I was singing a song, and Bill was shouting at me from behind me. He said, "Sing it like Pete Rowan. Sing it like you mean it."
That's right.
And it was like, I had no idea what I was doing. I thought I was doing my job, but I think he didn't want to hear any kind of complacency in the style of singing. You know, the guy who lasted the longest with Bill Monroe was guitarist, singer Jimmy Martin. He was with him twice, and first time he left him, Bill said, well, I wish you'd stay, but if you go out there and, if you want to come back, you're welcome. And so he did. He came back. So that means Bill had to make room for Jimmy Martin as Jimmy Martin the second time. And that's the music where the burning quality in Bill's trajectory as a band leader, that's where it got, with Jimmy Martin, that's where it really got hot, that was pretty much, Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs were, of course, the original bluegrass band, but the way Bill saw it, the original bluegrass band was String Beans and Sally Forrester. Bill got on the opera by singing a solo, not by doing a band.
Mm-hmm.
But he always had a group. He always had a group because he knew how to play for dancers. He had a tighter group than a show group. It wasn't just a show group, and that's not downing any show groups because they get tight. But Bill used to say, you've got to watch the dancers' feet. You've got to basically play a music that relates to their bodies, so it relates to the body and moves the body, goes to the heart. And, like Chuck Berry, when he came out and did rock and roll, he didn't come out and perform rock and roll. He was rock and roll. He was as much of a kid dancing as any of us were in those days, right? He danced across the stage, and Bill Monroe even danced on stage occasionally.
For me, it's somewhat of a fantasy, because when you were starting doing the Mexican Air Force stuff is when I came out of the womb in the late 70s. So, for me, this is about, music was meant to be danceable music. And so therefore it was about getting people up so that they could get down. Whereas, in some ways, as I look at the musical landscape now, larger venues, more rock-oriented venues, as opposed to those, rural, it's just so fascinating to me, the old South that, so to speak, that you were part of, the streams and the rivers and the festivals. It was on a smaller scale, but I would love you to talk about how you would, let's say this, how would you feel after a concert when you guys were just on fire, even if it was in front of 15 people? But what was that feeling like, that visceral quality of being in a small venue with people and you were getting their feet to move and getting it to their heart?
Well, are you talking about bluegrass?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that wasn't about getting people to dance. It was the music that had come from the dancing, and one of the things they liked was the real rural crowds, like in Alabama and places like that. It was that Bill had taken square dance music and given it nobody can really define what it is about bluegrass, but he gave it an edge that allowed them to hear church music and dance tunes that they used to dance to, but done in a highly polished, really, more. It was Bill found a way with his drive. He had a lot of personal drive that to give the sense of drive to the music that comes from old-time gospel singing and the blues, definitely the blues, and Scots-Irish balladry. So when they heard it, it was like it came from the people, but when he played it back to them, it was almost like you don't dance to that. This is a concert,
Mm-hmm.
It's the kids, the rock and roll kids who turned it back into a danceable music, And there's been controversies at festivals. Won't those kids stop dancing in front of the stage? We can't see.
Right. No, and
people are sitting in their lawn chairs complaining about the dancers. So it's come full circle in that sense. But it was more awe-inspiring to the audience than to be dancing. It was something you just stood up and listened, or you sat up and listened to that stuff that Bill did, because it was more presentable than like it was a presentation. It's like, here is your music and your lives told through my music, and he'd sing to them, and I once asked him because he always talked about wearing a white shirt and a tie on the Grand Ole Opry, and I finally asked him one day, I said, what was important about that to you personally? He said, he knew that his audience were mostly farmers. Get that? Mm-hmm. He knew his audience were mostly farmers, and we're talking the 30s and 40s, into the 50s, and then into the 60s and 70s, even the 80s. Bill was still doing it. But he was kind of like a Woody Guthrie of country music. He was a singer-songwriter, and he took all his influences and realized that by giving it back to the people in a highly, actually intense form, really, it was a certain, it was wound up, It wasn't like a slack kind of thing. It was wound up. And the white shirts and the ties and the riding boots and the hats, well, power symbols basically is what they were. But I asked Bill, I said, what was so important to you about the white shirts? He said, well, knowing that his audience were farmers. He said he didn't want to show up in front of them wearing a checked shirt. He wanted to show them respect. Mm. Like when they'd go to church is when they'd wear a white shirt and maybe a tie. And so Bill basically took Sunday go-to-meeting clothes and added a sharper edge to the image. And when he played for the farmers, they were being treated to a guy showing them respect by not showing up in work clothes, but by showing up in your most presentable image, and that he said he knew that they would respect the music more, and he knew that they would think that he was respecting them. That's what he said.
I asked this question to Jeff Moldauer, who was, from New York area and, wound up putting out albums, real acoustic blues albums. And I asked you the same thing. I spent about 6 years in Boston, and I know that's where you're from. But it's how responsible, how much time did it take for you? You had experiences with Tex Mex groups in Boston. And the Bay State band that you were in. But in your mind, how did you become, how responsible was Monroe for you becoming an authentic bluegrass player? Because it's hard to, regionalism was so huge back then. You had different regions of music, and you didn't grow up in Appalachia. And I just try to say to myself, I just don't want to gloss over this, because I find it, your generation, it was a magical opportunity. You had all this mobility. The cost of travel wasn't that big a deal. People had their own tributaries and their own ways of finding out these things. And I really want to know, how did you get from Boston to the South and Bill?
Well, I heard the music first on the radio as a child. I heard country music, and all the pop music at that time was about, it was like songs like Shaboom and Frank Sinatra,
right?
And then the country station, which was a local Boston station, had a whole thing that sounded like a bunch of people getting together, and the bunkhouse gang, and all this. People sound like they're in a room together, all applauding. And I found out that was Jack Clemens and Buzz Busby and Scotty Stoneman. Jack Clemens was the producer for a whole lot of shaking going on in Memphis a few years later. He was in Memphis working for Sam Phillips at Sun Studios, and he was behind the control boards putting that slap back on Jerry Lee Lewis's Whole Lot of Shaking Going On, and the B-side of that is his own composition called It'll Be Me. And so I was hearing these guys without knowing who they were, playing country music on the radio, bluegrass basically. Scotty Stoneman's one of the most fabulous original fiddlers you've ever heard. He's from the Stoneman family who moved up from Appalachia to the D.C. area. And Scotty, they call him the Jimi Hendrix of fiddling.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in a lot of ways. So all this stuff was on the radio, and I heard it, when it was time for me, before I was in kindergarten. My mother would let me listen to the radio, and she put on these stations, and pop music was didn't have the fire. It had finesse, it was, it didn't interest me. It was sort of like all about, it's going to be great, and we're together, and but I was young. I couldn't even tell what they were singing about. But I could tell the difference on the country songs were all about heartbreak, I could tell that difference right away, and rock and roll didn't exist as such yet, and they weren't playing anything too lively on the radio. And then I heard this guy play piano on the radio, a guy named Crazy Otto, and it was really basically barrel house polka piano, kind of a combination of old-time ragtimey piano playing polka tunes. And I heard Homer and Jethro, and I went up to the grocery store, and sure enough, they had both Crazy Otto and Homer and Jethro on little 45s. So I got those, listened to those at home, and then went up there the next time. They had a record by a guy named Little Richard, and I took it home, and I was like, whoa, wom bom ba loom bom ba lom bam boom.
Mm-hmm.
So the bluegrass was I heard it on the radio first, but my first group was a 4-piece rockabilly band, 5-piece. But we weren't classic rockabilly. We were more Buddy Holly style. Richie Valens and Buddy Holly. It had a little sweeter edge to it. So that idea of Tex Mex was what they were talking about when they talked about Buddy Holly. They said he plays Tex Mex rock and roll. And so that's where I first heard the term. It wasn't until years and years later that I got together with another innovator and giant in his style was Flaco Jimenez, who in Doug Somm's later years was in the Texas Tornadoes with Doug, but that's another story. It's just the bluegrass side of things. I was basically from age 8 until 12, I was going to square dances and dancing to old-time string bands. Because in New England at that time it was part of the actual college students at Harvard discovering old-time music, and a lot of them were from the South, and there were some great players in and around the Boston area that played the square dances. But I was too young to know the difference. I didn't, I just would love to dance. It was good fun. Then as I entered into my going around playing these little sock hops, they were called, rock and roll shows where our band would play. We were called the Cupids. And after those shows were over, they were only from like 6 till 8:30 because the kids were in school. Just started finding out about what was going on in the nightlife around Boston, and there was a place called the Hillbilly Ranch that played Bluegrass, a band called the Lilly Brothers from West Virginia, and this hot Texas fiddler named Tex Logan. And so we started to find out about this. And then the mind blower was, after one of those record hops, we went over, we had heard about this place, the 47 Club, and we pulled up outside with our drums and our guitars in it, and there was this girl on stage, a very good-looking young girl named Joan Baez, playing just a guitar, and I'd never heard anybody perform on just a guitar. And then that was the beginning of the discovery of the traditions, the blues and bluegrass and the folk singers like Gene Ritchie. And so you could go to Wurlitzer's Music in Cambridge, around the corner from the 47 Club, and you could go into a record booth and listen to records. And oh my God, I spent hours there. You know, here's Bill Monroe singing, you know, Columbus Stockade Blues, you know. And all the companies were all now trying to, like, market to the folkies. Here's folk music with the Stanley Brothers, you know, such great songs as He Fell Asleep and the Hogs Ate Him. You know, it was like people were have wildly different takes on what authenticity and what would sell. Because we weren't even aware at that point that people were trying to sell records. It just seemed that records were, you know, you couldn't even afford them, but they were the most fantastic repository of music, you know. And you discover Alan Lomax, and then the classic record, you know, by the one they're always talking about. That was another whole thing of old recordings from the 30s, 40s, old, like what Grail Marcus called, you know, old weird America. And certainly the songs were weird, and that's what people were listening to back in those days. So we started listening to what was people listened to, 30, 40 years before, and back to the turn of the century, the first recordings. And I discovered Jimmy Rogers, and I mean, it all happened really fast. You know, we were playing rock and roll, and then the Kingston Trio were there. They were coming out, and the airwaves changed. But you could now buy the records that I had heard when I was a kid, and so I didn't even know I didn't know the difference between square dance music and bluegrass music. I wouldn't have known. I wasn't aware, but I had heard the stuff when I was real young. And so, long story short, I went from dancing at square dances to playing square dances. And, you know, and then I'm 14, 15, 16 years old, still playing these record hops. And just now, someone in the band has a license, you know, and it means that we can get around. And, you know, there was a place called the Jazz Workshop in Boston where Miles Davis played, and there was a little coffee house called Cafe Yana in Harvard Square where the musicians would hang out before going over and playing jazz. So you walk into this little cafe, and it's like, you know, 2 or 3 conga drummers and some guy playing soprano sax real quiet.
This is just fantastic. I mean,
but they're playing quietly. They're not like out trying to blow anyone away. They're just feeling. So it was more about the groove. There's from square dance to hearing that was like the groove, and the good thing was, because I wasn't of age, I couldn't go in any bars, is that the coffee houses allowed, as a 14-year-old, you could go out at night and hear music. You can't do that anymore. There's just very few places that aren't alcohol-oriented. So that keeps, you know, you got to be 21 to play those places. I was 14 and going to places and hearing quality music. I made a good connection with Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, and that kind of blues was something that I could learn. I learned it, you know. And then John Lee Hooker was around at that time, and all these people were coming through and playing this Club 47. And then it just started exploding after that. But I was in a band from playing this sort of rock and roll dance band for high school kids. Then as we got more towards the college age, I started playing with some of those folks in Harvard Square who were in the college. They were 5 years older than I, but again, I didn't have to be of age to play the places we played.
I just wanted to. You brought up something very interesting about, not being aware of idioms, square dance versus country. You didn't know what the idioms were, and as a result, this allowed for an overlapping of all different types, a lot of experimentation. One reason I wanted to so desperately talk to Peter Rowan is because of a band that he put together. I wanted to play you this track of music, and then we'll come back and talk about it, okay?
All right.
I have been looking for these albums on LP. I have not been able to find the original Earth Opera album, and that was a track called Dreamless. And Peter, the reason I bring it up is because I look at the accompanists that were on this album, and it's mind-blowing to me, the dexterity. If you want to call them jack of all trades, masters of all trades, John Nagy, David Grisman, a dear friend of mine, Warren Smith, Bill Stevenson. When I talked to David Grisman, he said, I was jonesing to play bluegrass music in the late 60s, but Peter was just about darn burned out of it. And I would love you to just talk about your conception of Earth Opera. It is just, to me, one of those classic experimental bands that you cannot put any type of idiomatic label on.
I realized after Earth Opera had its run that I could have done the whole thing as a bluegrass project. But that's not what record companies were signing. In fact, I sent letters. When I left Bill Monroe, I sent letters out to all these record companies, and they said, we really appreciate hearing from you, but we're not signing any bluegrass acts right now, because Bill Monroe was still active, the Osborne brothers, Jim and Jesse, all the Grand Ole Opry acts, and way up there in the country somewhere was Del McCurry, keeping at it.
Right.
So I wasn't getting anything happening with playing bluegrass. And that track you just heard, it shows so many influences. It is a bluegrass tune. It's one of I wrote that while I was with Bill Monroe. But even I couldn't imagine it being played as bluegrass style, and yet that's what it is.
Right.
And that's what shows on our recording of it. Because David was a great blessing to have as a musical compatriot and collaborator and partner during those times, because at least my bluegrass roots could find a connection in the music that we were doing. In fact, Earth Opera was nothing more than me and David Grisman. The rest of it was all window dressing. No disrespect, but it's like, you had to be a band, and, our piano player was from Canada. We couldn't get a green card. And then the politics of all the other people got involved. And, they did great. Everyone did great. But when you look back at it and you go, it would have been so simple to just take what David and I did and do a record in Nashville, and it would have been probably more fulfilled, because the players down there are more mature in the roots side of things. But and I only say that because the years, the distance on it, I can hear what we were trying to do, and it's a pretty simple bluegrass song with wonderful chord changes. If Earth Opera had more of that on it, it might have been more of a hit, But as it was, most of the music was anti-bluegrass, in really slow and with heavy drums, like you said, Billy Monday and folks like that. And it was all an experiment, because nobody had any experience in making that kind of music. The producer had been producing classical Indian music. David and I had been playing bluegrass, and the rest of the folks were, and so it was great in a lot of ways. But I mean, I was in tears a lot of the time because
wow,
because I expected the studio to yield the same emotional high as just sitting down and playing the songs in the living room. With just David and I playing, it was complete. But now we're going to take it another step further in the studio, and we've got overdubs, and we've got multi-tracking, and it was very emotional. And well, actually, some of the harder tunes, the more rockin' tunes, have that. There is a big emotional quality in it. But that tune is a beautiful, light-hearted tune. It goes along with another one called "When You Were Full of Wonder." But hearing me sing those songs like I'm an English, I'm singing with a really broad sort of almost arch accent. I don't know why that happened, except that all the successful bands were from England. If I had sung that like a bluegrass tune, it probably would have been, much more fully true to its origins.
Well, I mean, don't try to be self-critical at this point in the juncture. I mean, the point is that this we're talking about those two albums that came out are very different, and like I said, they are very hard to find. But it's really interesting, and I appreciate your honesty about the politics of putting all these people together, because I was looking at it and saying, boy, Rowan is a genius. You got Grisman in there and Warren, because I hear timpani in there, and, there's jazz and there's all this colorful stuff. But the question is, the story I read is that you actually would open occasionally for the Doors. So what was it? It wasn't just you and David in a duo. You had that Stevenson and that band. Well, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And that recording you just played, we didn't have an actual full band at that point with the drums. We had the keyboard, Bill Stevenson on keyboard and John Nagy on bass, and the wonderful Billy Mundy and many other drummers on the record. And it was done at CBS in New York. And I've listened to it, and it's really a gorgeous record. It is really gorgeous. Standing
awesome.
aside for all this time, It is, so what happened was, as we got the only place to play was rock and roll places. And so we had this booking agency called APA out of New York, and they threw us in front of the Doors. And by then we had a drummer. No, the first few shows we didn't even have drums.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's films of it, but I don't know where they are.
Wait. Who has these films? We need these films immediately.
Well, Elektra Records made two promotional films of two songs. One, The Red Sox Are Winning, and the other one called Home of the Brave.
Right.
And it was a war period, and it was very anti-war, very submerged. A friend of mine in Germany, a DJ over there, said that he was floored by these records, the first record, because it was subterranean, and it was very slow. Everything was extremely slow. The only thing that I wished I had been able to just relax more and sing more like I sing, rather than the sort of strange voice. Well, what it was the theatrics. It was a theatrical voice. That's all it really was. It just, I'm not sure if that's a better voice than one's own voice.
But as an audience,
very articulated, and they were all what?
No, I if I was in the audience, I mean, if for an audience member, I just find that I love irregardless of the machinations or the amalgamations of the bands, the idea that you'd go to see a headliner like the Doors. That doesn't necessarily do a whole lot for me, but the idea of having an opening act like Earth Opera, it opens your mind, it opens your consciousness.
Sure.
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Well, then you're in front of like pop star phenomena like the Doors, and the next thing you need, the last thing you don't need is drums. You need drums because it's so you're talking 3,000-4,000 people in a room, and sound on stage being iffy, although, it was good enough. We were able to do it. But I'm saying that music became more defined by the drums after that, because we were in a rock and roll world. We weren't in a world there was no audience. You say that it's good to hear somebody that's not pinned down. Well, we knew it. We weren't being pinned down, and we would say to people, we don't want to be pinned down. But that's the most, for people that are trying to help you make a career, that's like, ooh. So it was all very haphazardly, it was, nobody knew what to expect. Nobody knew whether something was going to be popular or not, but it became very obvious that drum-based music what was driving the scene. So we became more of a rock and roll band by the second record. But initially, the first record's beauty is there's lots of, really good mandolin playing by David and great mandocello work. And the songs were fresh. I had written them when I was with Bill Monroe, but, they could have been bluegrass songs. They are bluegrass songs, but the thing is that the vibe was different. The vibe for people of my generation wasn't quite to the party level yet. It was very submerged, very somber, very depressed, actually, because this war thing was going on,
right.
and friends that I knew were dying over there. And by the second record, it was kick out the jams. There's no choice. You can't just stay in this subterranean bubble. We were underground. We rehearsed underground. But, while we were down in New York, when that record came out, the Jack Holtzman, the director of Elektra Records, put us with Simon and Garfunkel's management. And David and Grisman and I spent a long afternoon of nail-biting and questioning ourselves about loyalty to musicians that we had begun to engage up in Cambridge to back us up. And, Simon and Garfunkel's management said, well, we'll do the same thing we did with the demo. We made an incredible demo with the same producers, just the two of us. And the management for Simon and Garfunkel said, well, we'll do the same we did for Artie and Paul. And we'll just let us have that demo. We'll orchestrate it here in New York, and we'll put it out the same way. Well, guess what David and I said?
I'm thinking no.
Yeah, obviously, we said no.
Yeah.
I mean, you never know what could have happened.
But it's really amazing for someone like myself. Looking at these liner notes, now I have to go back, not just with your stuff, but it could be anything. It could be Oregon or any of this stuff, and seeing and believing that, oh yeah, the artists were in complete control of who they could put on the albums. And obviously, it's great to be able to talk to you about this stuff, because a lot of people will gloss over it. But because I've interviewed over 300 musicians, it's just fascinating to hear how the companies really wanted the polished, we know what's best. We can stroke it. We can do it. And then you have the artists, gifted artists like Dog and you, and you're saying, no, we want our Boston-based crew. It's amazing, really. And it still goes on today, but to hear about it as a historical thing, when I saw Warren Smith on the album, I'm like, that's amazing. Cause that guy, he's part of M Boom with Max Roach. And I'm like, he's playing with Peter, but again, that, who knows how that,
what was he doing? Percussion or what?
Well, again, he was doing, it says drums and percussion, and Warren, quite honestly, can play anything from gongs to timps. I mean, he was a Broadway. He was on the original West Side Story. So I'm just
okay. Well, so see, we didn't have a drummer, so we had this wonderful, Peter Siegel, who produced us, had this wonderful phone that he used to call all these people to come in, and that's what was exciting. When those guys showed up, and there was a third drummer. Maybe it is Warren Smith, but there was magic with those tracks. It was really by the second album that now we were a rock and roll band, and now we're a bunch of real amateurs trying to make a record in the studio. That first record, I think a lot of the original vibe survived into the record. because there were 2 records, and by the second one we were out on the streets. We were playing rock and roll venues, and that's not what we had started out to be. We had started out to be more like what the first record was. But, when you get thrown in front of the doors, it becomes very clear that the only way you can even hear what you're doing on stage is having a good drummer.
It's amazing.
That changed things. Yeah.
Well, we were talking to a very glib and gifted artist, and we're not going to rush anything here, but I'm going to play you another tune now that from a very, very serious band, and then we'll come back and we'll evaluate it. Okay?
All right.
I married me a wife. She gave me trouble all of my life. She ran me out in the cold rain and snow. Rain and snow. She ran me out in the cold rain and snow. She came down the stairs, combing back her long yellow hair, and her cheeks were as red as a rose, as a rose, oh Lord. And her cheeks were as red as a rose. I've done all I can do to try to get along with you, and I'm not going to be treated this way, this way. Oh Lord, and I'm not going to be treated this way.
So, how do you feel about your voice on that one?
Well, I realized that part of that, I do have a Boston accent.
Park the car, huh?
Well, it's there, even though I more or less, adopted the music of the South, as the expression that I like, and pretty much could talk it, and sing it. But once I drifted away from material that I wasn't copying, or this, I think this probably been my whole development. Is Bill Monroe saw right away that I was submerging myself in his sound, which he required, but at the same time, he was pushing me to pushing me out of the nest. He was saying, "Sing it like you," and I probably, have been able to do that more in the last 30 years. All this stuff is all 40 and 50 years old that you're playing.
Well, okay. So, just for the audience, that was Mule Skinner, with Richard Green and Bill Keith, David Grisman, John Kahn, and John Guerin on drums. You had a drummer there as well.
For part of it, but Clarence White is playing guitar.
I wanted to leave it for him because my question, the sophistication of the band and the dexterity of the band, Clarence was really, I mean, do you feel Mule Skinner would have really had some traction? I mean, his death was so untimely at that point.
Well, he had just left the Byrds and started playing with Rowan again, and they were doing an electric thing. And so they're out in Palmdale, which is, again, here's the problem. If you want to play bluegrass, and at that point country music, you had to play the worst or hardest to get to worst places. Clarence finished the gig and some drunk ran him down, I mean, the worst thing about the music life is the risk of your own life to things like that. I mean, we lost the great Clarence White because he decided not to be on the fast track anymore, but to play from the heart and play locally and develop his own music. So he got off the tour with the Byrds, and what happens? You know what I mean? It's just like, it's a terrible, terrible trap. I face it all the time. I'm always getting on planes. I'm still touring. And I also have friends that play locally, and some of them are even more tired than I am because they play 6 nights a week locally, and I only have to play a weekend getting on the road. But I have to stay on the road to get the next weekend. That's the other thing. Is like I never got to the point where the bus tour was financially possible. I mean, really, people. I think I've just outlasted my demise long enough to be well known.
Well, I mean, it's also the idea of never stop growing. I mean, you have not.
Oh, that's the key. And I wanted to say something about, David. Yeah, when we got together, he wanted to play bluegrass. He had already done a little work with Garcia and the Grateful Dead. 5 years later, we had Olin in the Way. It was just 5 years later. We were doing bluegrass in a way that was so far beyond our own understanding of it that even today, you listen to that stuff and you go, that was intense, man. We were really, really into it. And Vassar Clemens had joined the band too. But as you say, never stop growing. That was probably my feeling more than any other feeling. I didn't know how to bring it to fulfillment at that time. But I also had a sense of keep it open, keep moving. With the amount of records I made I made a record. Let's just say from '64 when I worked with Bill Monroe, we made a record, and then in '68 we made '69 we made 2 Earth Opera records. We made Mule Skinner. We made Olden in the Way. We made Sea Train. 2 records, Sea Train.
Sure.
That's all between 1964 and 1971. That's a lot of records.
Well, and that's the time. Listen, as I pursue the ethnomusicology school at UCLA, that's the time. I'm focusing on 63 to 73 because the mind expanding experiment. There's a whole myriad of reasons why it occurred, but you just put it right there. You said, look at the evolution. Look how much stuff was put out, and thank God it was. I am so enjoying this. I wanted to talk to you about your family. I wanted to talk to you about Stinson Beach, and I wanted to get into quite a few other things. And I was just hoping that we could set up a time for part 2.
Yeah, anytime, man. Just set it up. I'm into it. We can do it.
I dig it too, man, and I really appreciate you taking the time out, and we'll be in touch, my friend.
Thank you, man.
All right, take it easy.
Take good care.
All right,
Okay.
This is the Jake Feinberg Show. We'll see you all in a little bit.